So this is my lighting setup. I have 4 compact fluorescent lights, which are sometimes referred to as CFLs. And the CFLs are arranged to be hopefully equal distance from the object and at a slight angle as well. So the idea there is to try and light the object or the subject as evenly as possible, and that means the front and the sides are getting an equal amount of light to try and just reduce any variance or shading detail. But however, each object will have its own kind of characteristics, as we'll see later with a Doughnut. And then you can see my turntable as well. I've covered my turntable in something called flock velvet, which it was just easily bought off of Amazon. The type of flock velvet I bought came with a sticky back, so you just unpeel the back and you can just stick it to the turntable or to anything you want to use as a stand. Here I've used a small tin can and a metal tube to create a stand, so I can put my objects on that, and so I can actually so you can see from the photograph, I'm able to not just light the top of the object, but I can light the underside as well. So we're trying to achieve even light all over the object. Okay, now that I've shot my photographs, I've imported the photographs into Lightroom, and now we need to look at the photographs and do some editing. Look at the mainly what we're looking at here is white balance. So if I click on this unprocessed photograph of the Doughnut, I can actually see, or I can see that this I've actually not got the white balance right on my camera. Now ideally you want to get that white balance right out the gate because it saves having to do it in Lightroom, but because I've shot my photographs in the raw format, it's not a disaster. I can actually alter the white balance. So if I go to the first image here in the sequence, which I've already adjusted, this actually looks somewhat kind of grey-ish and lacking contrast to a degree, but that is by design. So if I just try to get into the develop settings. So if I click on the arrow there and go into develop, we can see what I've done. So I've used a custom white balance setting. Probably what I would have done here is I would have set the white balance to fluorescent like that. And in my opinion, that's probably a little bit too cool. So I've kind of like brought it up to 4000K. And I've reduced the tint, I think, to 10. And then what I would do is I would go through all the other settings. I would tend to leave exposure and contrast alone. I would tend to reduce my highlights a little bit, so and boost up the shadows, which is the sort of general thing that I would do. But yeah, it's a case-by-case thing. And then we go through all the settings. We can the present settings are like high-pass filters. And we can use that to sort of increase the sort of almost the detail in the photograph. Again, we can adjust the sort of tonality of the photograph. What I tend not to do is use the sharpening too much, although there is a sort of default amount of sharpening there, and definitely leave the denoise alone. We don't add that because that will add or take away information from our photographs, which is not helpful in the photogrammetry process. And then simply from there, I would click on my first photograph and I'd scroll to the end of the sequence, which is there. And I would press sync to synchronize the settings across the entire set. And because this set of photographs was set under artificial lights and there's no change in the lights, you can do this with a degree of confidence. And then I often just go back to the gallery view and I can see the thumbnails update. So I've now imported all my Doughnut photographs into Metashape. This is done relatively easily by just going to the workflow menu and pressing on add photos and navigating to where the photos are. And the first thing that I want to do once I've got my photos into Metashape is I want to find my mask, or at least the image that I'm going to use to generate masks, which is this image right here, which is it's just simply the stand without the donut. And what I tend to do at this stage is I will just disable this image by right-clicking on it and selecting Disable Image. And then at this point I also will switch on the Show Masks feature. So I can see that I've got no masks generated at the moment, and I'll just click on one of these photos. It doesn't matter. I'll do a right click and we'll go to the mask menu and we will import masks, and we want it to be set to from background. Replacement is fine. You could add to an existing mask if you want to, and we need to name the file that is the mask, which in this case is dsc_00225.tiff. And we're going to apply this to all images, and then we press OK, and then we need to navigate to the folder that actually contains that image, which is Photo Export 2 in this, and we just select that folder, and then Metashape will start to generate the masks. And the reason why we have the masks visible is so that we can see what Metashape is actually doing as it's generating the masks, because sometimes you might want to adjust the threshold, maybe you want to increase the amount of the donut that's appearing in the mask, or decrease the settings so that you get it's more cut out. So Metashape has now finished generating the masks, and if there are any problems at this point, I mean, I can like double click on any one image and examine what the mask looks like, and I could say I could right click on the photo and go to masks. We could look at the settings, and if we could adjust the tolerance here if we're losing too many darks on the donut or seeing too much of the background, we can change this tolerance value and then regenerate masks as and when is necessary. So now that we've got all our masks generated, it's time to go to workflow and align our photographs, and we're just going to use the default settings. So Metashape has now finished aligning the photographs, and we can see our sparse point cloud here. We can see there's a few erroneous dots or key points around the donut. It's not terribly crucial. I mean, there are methods for cleaning up the sparse point cloud that we won't go into here. We're simply going to look at our camera alignment by clicking on the camera icon at the top here. And here you can really see how the donut was done. If I just orbit around the donut, you can see that the photographs were taken in 3 rings. So on the 3 axes, so it's like X, Y, and Z. There's a ring for each one of those, and each one of those rings has 24 photographs in it. And because we did it on a turntable, the photographs are relatively evenly spaced, although it doesn't have to be totally accurate. We still get good coverage of most of the views of the donut. And I would say that one of the weaknesses here is you can already start to see that the inner part of the donut perhaps doesn't get quite as much light as the outer ring. But from this point, we are just simply ready, because our camera alignment has been successful. We can just simply go on to the next phase, which is to go up to workflow and build the mesh. And we're going to set this to high because it's a relatively small object. I don't expect the end resulting mesh will have a huge amount of polygons in it, so we could probably even go to ultra high if we really wanted to spend the extra time. But we could go into the advanced tab and change some settings in here, like calculate vertex colors is often useful, but we're going to leave it as it is and just generate the mesh like that. So now Metashape has completed generating the mesh. I'm going to hide my photos and just going to look at the mesh itself. And we can see it's done a pretty decent job by the looks of it. We've only got vertex color here. Now sometimes at this point I might consider building a texture, but whether I build a texture or not really is dependent on how actual vertices we have in the mesh. So if we look at the 3D model in the workspace and we click on that, we can come down and look at how many vertices we've got. So we've actually got 500,000 vertices in this case. Now, if I wanted to actually bake a texture off of this object, say it was a 2K texture. A 2K texture would have slightly in excess of 4 million pixels in it. So if we say the donut has, in terms of vertex color, only has 500,000. It's got nothing like as many points as it might have pixels in the texture. So arguably we kind of want to make a texture. In order to capture the color information of the donut, we actually, to get that sort of equivalent 2K texture, we're going to have to make a texture. So we'll go up to workflow and build texture. It's going to be a diffuse map, although we can bake other sorts of maps as well. We're going to leave it to the default settings. We can change the mapping in some cases to like an ortho or adaptive ortho if we've got a nice flat plane, but we're going to leave it on generic, and sometimes using the blending modes of, say, average might help a little bit in some cases, or even possibly the max and min intensities, but I think mosaic will be fine in this case. And of course we're aiming for a 2K texture, so just press OK. That shouldn't take too long. So Metashape has finished building the texture now, and it's looks like it's done a fairly reasonable job. And yeah, and here we can see the sort of the inside of the donut is actually a little bit dark, where the lighting setup hasn't quite got to it. But however, the texture just generally look pretty decent, and we can toggle it back and forth between model shaded, which is our vertex color. I mean, if we zoom in on it, we can see this is our vertex color, which is kind of okay, but it's not that high res. And then we can swap back to the textured version, and we can see it's got more information in it. So we definitely need our texture. At this point, we can go into tools, we can choose mesh, and we can actually view the mesh UVs, and we can see what Metashape's done. It's just created these generic sort of UV islands, which is kind of quite crazy when you look at it. But at this point, what I do is I press 5 on the keyboard to get rid of perspective and turn it into an orthographic view. And we're just going to slightly clean up the rotation of the donut. So I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard to get into the front view, and then we come up to the object rotation, and we're just going to choose rotate object, and we could click on the gizmo, or we can just click outside to rotate it, whatever. We're just trying to straighten it out, so it sort of looks fairly level in the front. Then I can press 3 on the keyboard to get to the side view, and sometimes I use the edge of the viewport to just sort of gauge how straight something is, so we can rotate it back. We go into the top view. In this case, it's not that useful, so we'll go back to 1 and see if it's still level. Yeah, back to 3, kind of rotate it maybe a little bit more. We'll bring it up, perhaps, might be just the bottom of the donut. Let's go back to 1, straighten it up, back to 3. That's probably good enough. And then sometimes at this point, it's useful to rotate region to view, and then we can resize that region. If you just click on the resize region option there, and we can just scale down this box. This is usually most helpful if there's a lot of points outside that you don't want to have any effect on the end result. So if we go to the side view, we can sort of like scale that down like that. You can see it in the top view as well. And back to 1, press 5 to go back to perspective, and then click off of that. And so our donut is ready to be exported now. And so I simply will go up to File, Export Model, and we will save our donut as, well, whatever we want to call it. And at this point, because we're the vertex color wasn't detailed enough. We're not going to export with vertex color, so we're going to export it with a texture, and I'm going to choose a PNG format so it's lossless, and we just click OK. So once I've exported my high poly Doughnut, it is actually also possible to create a low poly in Metashape, and the way that we can do this is we could go over to the tools menu and go down to mesh, and we can actually decimate our mesh. And say we choose 8,000 as our target, and then click OK, and it'll ask me if I want to replace my default model, and this will be a case of no, I don't. So it's going to create a second model which is decimated, and there we are. It's quite quick, and from this point actually we can obviously go up to workflow, and we can build another texture for this, and so we can essentially bake the texture, the diffuse texture, onto our model. But also at this point we could also bake a normal map, and we can select the high poly in the source data and click OK, and also on top of that you can do occlusion and displacement. But however, we're not going to do that. We're going to process our Doughnut in Zbrush. So I've just opened up Zbrush and I've imported my Doughnut model into the tool palette, and I'm just going to click and drag on my viewport and draw the Doughnut, and immediately go into edit mode. Press T on the keyboard for that. I change my material to a flat color. I like to press Shift P to give me the floor, and then P again to go into perspective mode, and I also like to constrain the rotation axis to Y like that. And we can see our Doughnut, our high poly Doughnut's looking pretty decent. And all I'm simply going to do here is I'm going to make a duplicate of my high poly model. I'm going to dynamically solo that. And what we're going to do is we're going to press Shift F so we can see what the actual wireframe looks like. And I want to actually make my low poly in ZBrush, so we could decimate it first, but however, given that it's not a super high poly object, I think we're going to go directly to the Z remesher. And the advantage of the Z remesher is that it's going to enable us to create a quad mesh rather than a triangulated mesh. And for a Doughnut, it's a sort of a relatively primitive shape. I think quads would be quite nice, albeit not essential. So it's just simply going to choose my target, which I think, let's not be too crazy. Let's have 4, which will actually be 4K. We can allow it to adapt, and then we're just going to press the Z remesher button. So okay, we've done our first iteration of that, and it's kind of not too bad. It sort of looks a little bit lumpy, squibbly in places. So perhaps what we can do, in fact, if anything, it looks like it might be a little bit like it's got a lot of geometry in it. Perhaps we don't need as much. We could perhaps drop that down to 2K. Let's turn off the adapt. Let's just run the algorithm again. Now we've got a simpler mesh, and it also looks a bit cleaner. So yeah, I think that's a good result. From here, I will go to Z plugins and just click on that little icon there, and the menu appears on the left hand side of the screen, and what we're looking for is the UV master. I'm going to switch off symmetry, and I'm just going to unwrap the object, and if I press flatten I can see what it's done, and that's kind of okay. If I want to get rid of some of this distortion, I could create more poly groups, and then I could choose from the menu, I can choose to unwrap using poly groups to create more UV islands. But I think in this case, this will be fine. And then I can just simply now export my low poly Doughnut. One more thing before we go over to Substance Painter is we actually have to deal with our texture on the high poly Doughnut. So if we go down to the texture map here in ZBrush, we can see that we've got a 2K texture on our high poly Doughnut, and what we actually want is we want that texture to be baked into the high poly mesh. And as I mentioned before, if we hover over the Doughnut here, we can see the total points in the mesh. It's only 500,000. So what we can do with Zbrush is we can simply subdivide our high poly. So if we do a Control D, you can see subdividing geometry in UV2, 4 million polys there. But again, we want points, not necessarily polys. So if I hover over there, we can see that my total points is just under 3. So if we do it again, we've subdivided to nearly 12 million quads there. Well, it says quads, but it's poly quads, which means triangles. And we can see now that our total points are up to nearly 12 million there. So that's it's actually a fair bit over what we need, but we definitely, if we want to max out the detail in our texture, then we need an excess of some degree. So this will be fine. And now really all I need to do is transfer that texture onto my newly subdivided high poly mesh, which is, we just simply go to poly paint and we go poly paint from texture, at which point we have to turn on that mRGB poly paint from texture again. Now we can sort of test how good that has worked out if we go back to the texture map, and we can turn on the texture map and turn it off. So we can toggle it on and off like that, and you can see how good it is, and it seems that it's pretty good. That's the texture on, that's the texture, that's the vertex color. So at this point, I actually like to just turn off the texture like that, and I'll go to UV map and I'll delete the UV off of my high poly. And now I'm ready to export my high poly donut with the baked in vertex color into Substance Painter. And the reason why we do this is because Substance Painter will not bake the texture from a high poly object. It will only bake vertex color. If we wanted to do that, we could use Substance Designer, which will do that. But however, we're going to use Substance Painter. So I've now imported my low poly donut into Substance Painter. And the very first thing that I want to do now is to bake the high poly onto the low poly. So to do that, I just come over to this Mesh Maps tab and just press on Bake Mesh Maps. Okay, so here in the baking menu, I can set up the settings. So basically, I want to make sure that the output size is what I want. In this case, it's 2K. I need to load in my high definition mesh, which we can just simply click on that dialog and navigate to wherever our mesh is. And then we can set our cage distances. So if the cage is not big enough, by default, Substance Painter will show this. And this is one of the nice things about Substance Painter. It gives you this visual feedback as to how well your low and high poly overlap. And in some cases, if your transforms haven't been set up correctly or they've been garbled in some way, you can actually see this in the viewport. So we want to set our frontal distance so that all that red goes away, and that looks okay. We might set the max rear distance to something similar. And then we want to look on our common settings, make sure this is all the common settings, and then we want to make sure we've got all the mesh maps selected that we want. So in some cases we might want a height map, so we'll select that. And also we want to click on ID here, because ID is where we're going to get our actual color from, or our base color. And in this case, by default, it says vertex color, but often this will be material color. And so you could bake a color off of a material, but we want it to be vertex color. And then we can just simply press bake, and it will bake our mesh maps. So now our bake is finished. We can see the final baked in texture. What I generally do is I create a fill layer, and I will load the base color, which is this color map from Mesh Doughnut, and you can just drag and drop it into the color of the fill layer. And for this particular case, in order to produce the roughness values, what I tend to do is I will create a base roughness, which is the highest roughness value that I want to assign to the donut, and I create that as a base layer, and then I will create a secondary layer above that, which will contain the sort of the smoothest parts. And then what I do as I mask my smoothness layer by I'll actually just drop in the color information again into there, and then use the levels to kind of correct it to something that looks more appropriate. So I think if we look at roughness by itself, you can see basically what I've done there. But also one of the things with the donut is the icing. So I did an additional layer for the icing to make the icing a little bit smoother. And then if you press M on the keyboard, it goes back to the donut. So we can see that our donuts turned out reasonably well. We can see that the inner part of the donut is actually a little bit darker than it ought to be. We could correct that. If we go to the base color, we can see that it's actually baked into there. So we could actually fix that in Photoshop. Or if we were going to fix it at the lighting stage, we'd need more sort of lights that would potentially cast light onto that. But I'm not sure that's really that practical. So it's probably easier to just fix it in Photoshop. And there we are. We're pretty much done. All it is, we can actually export our texture. So if we do it's a Control-Shift-E to bring up the export menu. There's a default in the output templates. You can actually choose something like Sketchfab, and you can just upload this model directly to Sketchfab, and it will sort everything out for you pretty much. But often you might want to create like a custom export setting, and I have a number of them. It's useful to recognize that, say if I choose one of these settings like PBR roughness, which is generally the sort of texture settings that we want. A Substance Painter uses converted maps for some things, so and often we will default to like DirectX. If you're using Blender, you might want to use an OpenGL, but it's also worth noting that if you choose one of these converted maps, it will bake your height information, or convert the height information and combine it with the normal map. And if you don't want that because you want a separate normal map, you actually might want to change this normal map to an input map. Or even if you just want what the Substance Painter baked, you could just choose the mesh map from, well, the normal from the mesh map here, and then just drop it into the export setting. And you might want to just maybe make a duplicate of this setting so that it doesn't overwrite the existing one. And obviously then you choose whatever setting you've made from the drop down menu here and save it and export.